Some stories aren't just meant to be told, they are meant to be felt. This is one of them. There are moments in life that test the depths of our pain, moments that force us to confront what it truly means to be alone. And then, sometimes just when we think all hope is lost, fate steps in. Tonight, you will hear a story about loss, about loyalty, and about a letter that was never meant to be forgotten. A story that proves love doesn't always come in the way we expect, but when it does, it can save a life. This is a story that will break your heart, but by the end, it just might heal a part of it too. Welcome to Vale Marks. Stay until the very last moment. You won't regret it. The storm raged outside, hammering against the window panes like an unrelenting force, as if the heavens themselves were mourning something unseen. Thunder cracked through the night sky, a deep, reverberating sound that rattled the walls. To Mike, it wasn't just a storm. It was a memory, a cruel echo of the past. The flash of lightning lit up the small, dimly lit room, revealing its sparse furnishings. A worn-out couch, a coffee table cluttered with unopened letters, a framed photograph turned face down on a shelf, as if its owner could no longer bear to look at it. In the center of it all, slouched in a chair, was Mike. His fingers were wrapped tightly around a glass of whiskey, the ice long melted, diluting the last remnants of amber liquid at the bottom. He hadn't taken a sip in over an hour. He just held it, as if the weight of the glass could somehow ground him, keep him from slipping further into the abyss. His breath was heavy, slow, almost forced. The storm outside couldn't drown out the noise in his head, the voices, the screams, the gunfire. He closed his eyes, but the battlefield awaited him there. He could see it so clearly, the suffocating heat, the deafening chaos, the smell of burnt metal, sweat and fear, and the bodies. Mike clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the glass. He had survived. Somehow, he had come home when so many others hadn't. But home wasn't home anymore. It was just another battlefield, a quieter one, but just as merciless. A loud clap of thunder jolted him back to the present, his heart hammering against his ribs. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face, his stubble rough against his palm. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, suffocating him. The silence, the stillness, it was unbearable. He needed to move. Without thinking, Mike set the glass down, grabbed his worn-out leather jacket, and stepped out into the night. The rain was relentless, drenching him within seconds. But he didn't care. He walked without direction, his boots splashing through puddles, water soaking into the frayed edges of his jeans. The cold air bit at his skin, but it was a welcome contrast to the fire that burned inside his chest. He didn't know where he was going, and maybe that was the point. Minutes, maybe hours passed. He lost track. The world around him was a blur of flickering streetlights and the occasional honk of a passing car. Then, in the periphery of his vision, something unfamiliar. A sign illuminated by a dim street lamp. City Animal Shelter. Mike came to a slow stop. He had never been here before, had never even thought about it. And yet, for some reason, his feet carried him forward. The shelter was quiet at this hour, the lights dim, but as soon as he pushed open the door, the noise hit him. Barking, dozens of dogs, each one desperate for attention, for freedom. Their cries were loud, echoing off the walls, filling the air with an unrelenting cacophony of need. Mike didn't move at first. He just stood there, taking it all in. The desperate eyes, the frantic tails wagging behind steel bars. He could feel their loneliness, their longing. It was suffocating. Then, his gaze landed on one. Unlike the others, this one didn't bark, didn't pace, didn't beg. A massive giant Pitbull sat in the farthest corner of the enclosure, still as stone. His coat was sleek but soaked, the rainwater still clinging to him. Muscles rippled under his dark fur, giving him an almost intimidating presence, but it wasn't his size that caught Mike's attention. It was his eyes, deep, dark, unfathomable, like an ocean in the dead of night. They locked onto Mike's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was knowing. The world around them faded. The barking, the thunder, the rain. It all disappeared into the background. Mike took a slow step forward, his heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. The Pitbull didn't flinch. Another step. Still nothing. No growl, no movement. Just silent observation, as if waiting for something. And then, for the first time in what felt like years, Mike felt understood. He wasn't looking at just a dog. He was looking at something else, something deeper. A soul as lost as his own. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring into those eyes. But in that moment, the storm in his chest quieted, just a little. A voice snapped him out of it. "You're the first person he's acknowledged all day." Mike turned. A woman stood nearby, her arms crossed over her chest, wearing an expression of cautious curiosity. She was one of the shelter workers, dressed in a navy blue hoodie with the shelter's logo embroidered on it. Her name tag read, Sarah. "He just came in yesterday," she continued, glancing at the Pitbull. "Picked up wandering the streets in the middle of the storm. No microchip, no tags, nothing." Mike looked back at the dog. His ears twitched slightly at Sarah's words, but he didn't break eye contact with Mike. "He's a big one," Sarah added, walking up beside him. "Most people take one look at him and keep walking. Pitbulls don't get adopted easily." Mike didn't respond. He didn't need to. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew. This wasn't a random stop. It wasn't an accident. This dog, this silent, drenched, unreadable creature, wasn't just another stray. They were meant to find each other. Without a word, Mike turned to Sarah and said the only thing that made sense. "I'll take him." For the first time that night, Diesel moved. Not much. Just a small shift in his weight, a flick of his ear, the barest tilt of his head. But Mike saw it, and he understood. The storm outside continued to rage. But for the first time in a long time, Mike felt like he wasn't drowning anymore. The first night in Mike's home was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The rain had long since stopped, leaving behind the damp scent of earth and asphalt. Inside, Diesel lay on the wooden floor beside Mike's bed, his massive body curled in a silent vigil. He didn't whine or pace. He simply stayed. Mike lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, save for the faint amber glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds. His mind, however, was far from still. Sleep had become a battleground for him, a place where the past clawed its way back into his consciousness without mercy. But tonight, something felt different. Every time his breath hitched, every time his fingers curled into the sheets, Diesel shifted slightly, as if sensing the unrest. Hours passed. When Mike finally drifted into sleep, the nightmare came swiftly. Explosions, dust, a heat so thick it suffocated. He saw them, his brothers in arms, heard their voices, their shouts, and then silence, the kind that didn't just ring in his ears but settled in his chest, heavy and unbearable. He gasped awake, drenched in sweat, heart hammering. Before panic could fully take hold, something warm pressed against him. Diesel had lifted his head onto Mike's chest, his breath slow and steady, grounding him. There was no urgency in his movements, no frantic attempts to comfort, just presence, solid, unwavering. Mike let out a shuddering breath and, for the first time in a long time, felt like he wasn't alone. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had to speak about. Mike was a man of few words, but Diesel didn't need them. Their conversations were in the silent glances exchanged over morning coffee, in the steady sound of Diesel's paws against the hardwood floor, as he followed Mike from room to room. When Mike sat on the porch, lost in thought, Diesel sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if watching over him. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic breakthroughs, just the quiet companionship of two souls who understood what it meant to be broken and to keep going anyway. And then came the unexpected moments, ones that snuck up on Mike when he least expected them. It started with an old harmonica. One evening, as the sky turned gold with the setting sun, Mike found it buried in a drawer, dusty, forgotten. He turned it over in his hands, hesitating before bringing it to his lips. The first notes were rusty, uneven, like an echo of something he once knew. And then Diesel lifted his head. At first, Mike thought nothing of it. But then, as he played another note, Diesel opened his mouth and let out a long, mournful howl. It was so unexpected, so oddly timed, that Mike nearly dropped the harmonica. Diesel paused, tilting his head as if waiting for another note. Amused, Mike obliged. The next howl was longer, more dramatic. Mike stared at Diesel in disbelief before a laugh burst out of him, uncontrolled, raw. It was the kind of laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. Diesel, apparently encouraged by the sound, continued his performance, tilting his head back and singing along with the harmonica, each note more exaggerated than the last. Mike laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes. For the first time in forever, the house felt lighter. The weeks stretched on, and with them, a new routine. Every afternoon, Mike and Diesel would walk the trails behind his house, where the trees arched overhead like an unspoken promise of peace. The late summer light would stream through the branches, casting dappled shadows over the ground, and Diesel would trot ahead, occasionally glancing back as if to make sure Mike was still there. It became the best part of Mike's day, these quiet walks where nothing needed to be said, where he didn't have to be anything other than a man taking one step at a time. Somewhere along the way, he started writing again. At first, it was just brief notes, fragments of thoughts jotted down on the back of envelopes or receipts. But soon, he found himself reaching for an old notebook, the pages worn from years of neglect. He wrote about the way Diesel listened without judgment, the way the dog seemed to understand the weight he carried without asking for an explanation, and one evening, without fully realizing why, he wrote something else, a letter, not to anyone specific, not even to himself. It was short, just a few sentences, but it held more meaning than anything he had written in years. If anything happens to me, take care of Diesel. He's family. He stared at the words for a long time before closing the notebook. Maybe he'd never need it. Maybe he would. But at least, for now, Diesel was here. And for the first time in years, Mike felt like he had something worth holding on to. The morning was eerily still. The sun had begun to rise, casting soft streaks of gold across the sky. But inside the house, there was only silence. Diesel stirred from his spot near the bedroom door, stretching his massive frame before shaking off the remnants of sleep. Normally by now he would have heard the familiar sounds of Mike moving around the house, the creak of the floorboards, the soft clinking of a coffee mug against the counter, the faint hum of the radio playing old tunes in the background. But today, there was nothing. The quiet felt wrong. Instinctively, Diesel padded toward the closed bedroom door, his ears twitching at the absence of sound on the other side. He pressed his nose against the wood, inhaling deeply. Mike's scent was there, but something was off. It was too still, too cold. A deep unease settled in Diesel's chest. He lifted a paw and scratched at the door, a gentle nudge at first, then more insistent. No response. Diesel let out a low whine, pacing in front of the door before pressing his weight against it, his claws scraping against the wood. Still, nothing. A flicker of desperation sparked in his dark eyes. He let out a sharp, urgent bark. Silence. And then, he did something he had never done before. He threw his weight against the door, slamming into it with enough force to make it rattle on its hinges. Still, it did not open. Something was wrong, deeply, horribly wrong. Diesel let out a long, piercing howl, a sound that carried through the empty house like a siren of grief. It was a call, a plea for something to answer back. No one did. The neighbors heard the barking first, then the howling. By the time the police arrived, the house stood in somber stillness once again, save for the occasional heavy thud of Diesel's body pressing against the door, his determination unfaltering. When the officers finally forced the door open, Diesel didn't lunge, didn't react with aggression. He simply stood there. And there was Mike, lying on the bed, still unmoving. The officers hesitated, momentarily taken aback by what they saw, not by the scene itself, but by the dog. A massive Pitbull sitting rigidly beside the bed, his head slightly bowed, his dark eyes locked onto the man who would never wake up again. Diesel did not move. He did not bark. He did not growl. He only watched. It was as if he already understood. A deep, aching silence filled the room, stretching between the living and the dead. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "He's been here this whole time?" one of them murmured. The other nodded. "Looks like it." But to them, Diesel wasn't a grieving companion. He was just a pit bull, a breed with a reputation they had already made up their minds about. One of the officers took a cautious step forward, placing a hand on his belt. "We need animal control," he muttered. Diesel didn't react to their presence. His world had narrowed down to one singular, undeniable truth. Mike was gone. But the world did not see him as a dog in mourning. It saw him as a threat. Within the hour, animal control arrived with their steel leashes and firm grips, treating Diesel not as a loyal companion but as a liability. He did not resist, even as they looped the pole around his thick neck. They led him away, out of the house, away from the only home he had ever known. And still, Diesel did not fight. But as they shut the door behind them, he turned his head one last time, looking back into the house, into the quiet that had swallowed his world whole. Mike was gone, and now, so was he. They took him to the city animal control center, a place filled with cold cages and indifferent stares. They took him to the city animal control center, a place filled with cold cages and indifferent stares. Diesel was too large, too strong, too much of what the world feared. He wasn't seen as a dog who had just lost the only person he loved. He was seen as a danger, a problem to be dealt with, a risk that couldn't be taken. When the intake officer glanced at his paperwork, his fate was sealed in ink. Breed, Pitbull, status, unclaimed. Note, no owner, no history. One check mark later, and Diesel had been placed under the worst category a shelter could assign. Restricted, do not rehome. It meant no second chances, no adoption listings, no rescue calls. It meant 7 days before he was scheduled to be put down. No one asked if Diesel had ever been aggressive. No one asked if he had a home. No one asked if he was loved, because no one knew. Mike had written a letter, but no one had found it. The only proof that Diesel was more than just another stray had been left behind, tucked away in a drawer, unseen by the world that had already decided his fate. Days passed. Diesel sat in his cage, motionless. The other dogs barked and whined, their desperation bouncing off the cold walls, but Diesel remained still, his gaze fixed on the metal bars in front of him. Every day, shelter staff walked past, barely sparing him a glance. No one stopped at his kennel, because no one would. The world had moved on, unaware that a dog once loved, once cherished, once a guardian in the darkness, now sat alone, waiting for something that would never come. 7 days. That was all he had. And as the clock ticked down, the world outside continued on, as if nothing had ever changed. But for Diesel, everything had. The news of Mike's passing reached John Carter on a crisp autumn morning. It arrived like a weight, pressing against his chest in a way that made it difficult to breathe. He sat in his truck for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard but seeing nothing. Mike was gone. John had lost brothers before, on the battlefield, in the chaos of war. But this was different. Mike had survived the war, only to lose the battle that followed, the one no one could see, the one that didn't leave visible scars but carved deep wounds all the same. After a moment, he exhaled and started the engine. He owed it to Mike to say goodbye. Mike's house was eerily quiet when John arrived. The officers had already come and gone, leaving behind only the stillness of a life cut short. The air inside was thick with something unspoken, something unfinished. John stepped into the living room, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The place was tidy, too tidy, as if Mike had been preparing for something, as if he had known. John swallowed hard and made his way through the house, pausing at a small table cluttered with unopened letters. A few bills, a couple of advertisements, nothing important. Then he moved to the desk in the corner. The drawers were mostly empty, save for a few scattered papers, an old notebook with frayed edges, and a single small wooden box. John ran his fingers over the surface before pulling it open. Inside were a few medals, a folded flag, and a photograph, one he hadn't seen in years. It was of him and Mike, younger, in uniform, standing side by side, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. John let out a slow breath. "Damn it, Mike," he muttered under his breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He was about to close the drawer when something unexpected happened. A breeze, soft but deliberate, swept through the room. It shouldn't have been possible. The windows were shut. But in that moment, something fluttered from the drawer, drifting lazily to the floor. John bent down, picking up the sheet of paper. It was old, the edges slightly creased, as if it had been handled more than once. And when he read the words, his breath caught in his throat. "If I'm not here anymore, please take care of Diesel. He's the only family I have." John's hands clenched around the letter, his heart hammering. Diesel? Who the hell was Diesel? And more importantly, where was he? John wasted no time. He grabbed his phone and started making calls, first to the authorities, then to the Animal Control Center, and finally to anyone who might have an idea where Mike's dog, his family, had been taken. Most of the responses were the same. No one knew. No one had details. No one could tell him anything. Frustration built in his chest, hot and suffocating. He slammed his fist against the dashboard of his truck, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had already lost Mike. He wasn't about to lose this dog, too. After nearly an hour of dead ends, his phone rang. It was a shelter worker, a woman named Sarah. "We have him," she said. "A Pitbull named Diesel." John gripped the phone tighter. "Is he okay?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Carter, Diesel was marked as unadoptable." John's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means he was placed under restricted status. No rehoming, no adoption, and a 7-day hold before euthanasia." A cold dread settled over John's body. "How much time does he have left?" Another pause. "Tomorrow is his last day." John's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "I'm on my way." John drove like a man possessed. His truck tore down the highway, the trees blurring past in streaks of orange and red as the sun began to set. He barely registered the road signs, the passing cars, the world beyond his singular focus. He had one day before Mike's last request was erased, before Diesel became another forgotten casualty of a system that didn't care. The thought made his jaw clench, his foot pressing harder against the gas pedal. The shelter was 30 miles away. He had to make it in time. Inside the shelter, Diesel lay curled up in the corner of his cold, steel kennel. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't moved much. He didn't cry, didn't bark like the other dogs. Because he knew, dogs had a way of sensing things. They knew when their humans were sad, when they were sick, and they knew when they weren't coming back. Diesel had stopped looking at the door days ago. No one was coming for him. The only person who ever would was gone. Tomorrow he would be led through that hallway, past the rows of other dogs who didn't know what awaited them. But Diesel knew. He had already lost everything. What did it matter if he lost this too? John's tires screeched as he pulled into the parking lot of the shelter, barely taking the time to slam the truck into park before jumping out. He ran to the front entrance, his heart pounding. "I'm here for Diesel!" he called out, breathless. Sarah, the shelter worker, was already waiting. She looked surprised at how fast he had arrived. "You're cutting it close," she said, but there was something like relief in her voice. John pushed past her. "Take me to him." Sarah led him through the rows of kennels, past barking dogs, past desperate eyes. The closer they got, the heavier John's chest felt, and then Diesel. He lay there, unmoving, his massive frame curled up, his head resting on his paws. He looked smaller than he should have, like a dog who had already given up. John's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Diesel." At the sound of his name, Diesel's ears twitched. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted his head. His dark eyes met John's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then something changed. Recognition, not of John himself, but of something familiar, a piece of Mike. Diesel's body tensed, and then, just barely, his tail moved. A slow, uncertain wag. John felt something tighten in his throat. "You're not alone, boy," he murmured. "Not anymore." Tomorrow, Diesel was supposed to die. But tomorrow would never come for him. Because John had found him, and this time, someone was staying. John's truck screeched to a halt in front of the city animal control center, his tires skidding slightly on the pavement. He barely registered the slam of the door as he jumped out, his boots pounding against the wet concrete. The sky above was a bleak shade of gray, a storm brewing on the horizon, but all he could think about was one thing: Diesel. He had made it. He was here. But was he too late? John shoved open the glass door and stormed inside. The fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the front desk, where a receptionist, a young man with tired eyes, looked up in mild surprise. "I'm here for Diesel," John barked, his voice hoarse from the long drive and sheer desperation. "The Pitbull. He's not supposed to be put down. I have proof. He has a family." The receptionist blinked, then frowned, typing something into the computer. John's patience was razor thin. His fingers twitched at his sides, his breath shallow. "Hurry up," he muttered, his stomach twisting. The man's expression shifted into something uneasy. "Sir, Diesel was already scheduled for euthanasia." John's blood ran cold. "What?" The receptionist hesitated. He was taken to the back just a few minutes ago." John didn't wait to hear the rest. He spun on his heel and ran. The hallway was long, the linoleum cold beneath his boots as he rushed past rows of kennels. The barking of dogs rose into a cacophony, echoing off the walls, but he barely heard it. Then, up ahead, a metal door. A red sign was bolted above it. "Euthanasia room, authorized personnel only." John's chest tightened. "Number—" "No, no, no!" He threw his weight against the door. It didn't budge. Inside, voices. "Hold him still!" A muffled whine. John's heart slammed against his ribs. He pounded against the metal. "Stop! Don't do it!" The voices inside paused. Then, slowly, the door cracked open. A man in a gray uniform stood there, clipboard in hand, brows furrowed. "Who the hell are you?" John pushed past him, his breath coming fast and shallow. And there, in the center of the stark white room, was Diesel. He stood frozen, a large steel leash looped around his thick neck. His body was tense, his eyes wide, not panicked, not aggressive, just resigned. He had given up. A vet technician was preparing a syringe. Another worker held Diesel steady, though the dog hadn't even tried to resist. John barely heard the man behind him shouting for him to leave. His whole world had shrunk to the dog in front of him. He took a single step forward, his voice breaking. Diesel. Diesel blinked. Something in his dark eyes flickered. Recognition, confusion, something long buried under days of abandonment. John turned to the stunned staff, his voice shaking with both fury and desperation. "Diesel has a family!" he roared. "Don't touch him!" The vet tech holding the syringe frowned. "Sir, I'm sorry, but the paperwork—" John yanked a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket and held it up with a shaking hand. "This," he said, his voice raw, "is the last thing Mike Grayson ever wrote. He was Diesel's owner, his best friend, and he's gone. But he left this—" He shoved the letter forward. "He asked me to take care of Diesel. If you kill him, you're killing the last thing Mike had left." The room fell silent. For a long, agonizing moment, no one spoke. John's pulse thundered in his ears as the workers exchanged glances. The clipboard man shifted uncomfortably. The technician with the syringe hesitated. Finally, the shelter manager, a woman in her 60s with gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, stepped forward. She took the letter from John's trembling fingers and read it slowly. Her expression softened. Then she sighed, folding the paper carefully before looking at her staff. "Stand down," she said. The tech holding the syringe lowered his hand. The leash around Diesel's neck loosened. John exhaled shakily. The shelter manager met his eyes. "You'd better be damn sure you can take care of him." John didn't even hesitate. "I am." She nodded once. "Then take him home." The tension broke all at once. Diesel felt the loosened leash first. Then, as if sensing the change in the air, he stepped forward hesitantly, his heavy paws clicking against the tiled floor. John knelt, extending his hand. "Come here, boy." Diesel paused, nostrils flaring. His ears twitched. He was still processing, still unsure if this was real. Then finally he moved. Slow, deliberate steps at first, then faster, and then Diesel pressed his massive head against John's chest, a low, trembling sound escaping from deep in his throat. Not quite a whimper, not quite a sigh, just something relieved. John closed his eyes for a moment, running a hand over Diesel's broad back. "I got you," he murmured. "You're safe now." The shelter workers watched, some quietly stunned, some subtly touched by the scene unfolding in front of them. One of them, the young receptionist, cleared his throat. "I'll get his paperwork." The manager gave a tight nod. "And get him a leash." Minutes later, John was leading Diesel out of the building, through the same door that had almost led to his death. The autumn air hit them like a breath of freedom. John paused at his truck, glancing down at Diesel. The dog looked up at him, ears perked, waiting. John reached out and scratched behind Diesel's ear, something warm settling in his chest. "Let's go home." And this time, someone was waiting for him. The drive home was quiet. John's truck rumbled steadily down the long stretch of road, but inside the cab, there was only silence. Diesel lay curled up in the passenger seat, his head resting on his front paws. He hadn't moved much since they left the shelter. He didn't whine, didn't glance out the window. He just lay there, silent, heavy, distant. John stole a glance at him. He had seen that look before, in men who had returned from war and never truly made it back, in those who had lost too much to keep going but didn't know how to stop. Diesel had survived, but he hadn't yet decided if he wanted to keep living. John tightened his grip on the wheel. "Well, buddy," he said gruffly, more to fill the silence than anything. "Welcome home." Diesel didn't react. John exhaled softly and turned onto the gravel driveway. John's home was a modest one. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy, well-lived-in house tucked away from the noise of the city. A wraparound porch, a backyard with just enough space for a dog to run. But Diesel didn't explore. As John led him inside, the Pitbull stepped through the door cautiously, his paws slow, deliberate. His dark eyes swept across the room, scanning the unfamiliar space, but he didn't seem to really see it. He wasn't looking for a new home. He was looking for the one he had lost. John filled a bowl with food and set it down near the kitchen. Diesel didn't move toward it. A soft sigh escaped John's lips as he watched the dog retreat to a quiet corner of the living room. Diesel lowered himself onto the floor, tucking his massive frame into himself, head resting on his paws once more. He was there, but he wasn't present. John had brought him home, but home wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, and Diesel hadn't found it yet. Days passed. Diesel moved only when necessary. He ate just enough to keep going. He followed John out of habit, but never with any real interest. The dog, who had once been Mike's shadow, who had once found purpose in every step he took beside his owner, was now adrift. John let him be. Healing took time. He knew that well enough. But then one evening something changed. John had been sorting through a box of Mike's old belongings, remnants of a life now frozen in time. Old photographs, a pocket knife with initials engraved in the handle, a few personal keepsakes. And then, his fingers brushed against something small, metallic, a harmonica. John paused, holding it between his fingers. He remembered Mike playing this thing back in the day, usually after a long shift at the base or on those rare, quiet nights in between deployments. The tune had always been the same. Low, soft, a little haunting. John exhaled slowly. Then, on impulse, he lifted the harmonica to his lips. The first note was shaky, rusty from years of neglect. The second was clearer. The melody drifted through the house, quiet, but full. John played without thinking, without expectation. And then, from across the room came a sound he hadn't heard in weeks. A deep, trembling howl. John's breath hitched. He lowered the harmonica and turned toward Diesel. The dog was sitting up, not just awake, not just watching, engaged. His ears twitched, his body tense, as if caught between memory and reality. John played another note. Diesel's head lifted slightly, his dark eyes locked onto the instrument. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he let out another low, mournful, familiar howl, the same way he had with Mike, the same way he had before everything fell apart. John swallowed the lump in his throat. For the first time since Mike had died, Diesel had reacted to something. For the first time, he had responded. The dog wasn't just existing anymore. He was feeling. John set the harmonica down and crossed the room, crouching beside Diesel. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. Instead, he simply rested a hand on the dog's broad back, fingers curling gently into his fur. Diesel didn't pull away. For the first time, he leaned in. And in that quiet, fragile moment, John knew. Diesel had finally found a reason to keep going. The story could have ended differently. Diesel could have been another forgotten name on a long list of shelter dogs who never got a second chance. He could have been reduced to nothing more than a statistic, lost in the cold, indifferent system that so often failed animals like him. But he wasn't. Because of a letter. A letter that had never been sent. A letter that was meant for no one but ended up saving a life. John hadn't expected anyone to care about the story. He hadn't planned on telling it, at least not beyond a few close friends. But word spread, first among the people at the shelter, then to other veterans who had served with Mike. And then it went further. A local journalist picked up the story. A soldier's final wish, a letter, a dog, and a second chance. It wasn't just about Diesel. It was about the men who came home, but never truly returned. The silent battles they fought in the dead of night. The ghosts they carried. The companions who never left their sides. The article gained traction, spreading beyond their small town. People across the country read about Mike, about Diesel, about how one dog had been the last connection to a man who had felt like he had no one left. And suddenly, something changed. People began to ask questions. How many other soldiers had come home to an empty house? How many loyal dogs had been left behind when their owners lost their battles to invisible wounds? How many lives, both human and canine, had slipped through the cracks simply because no one had been paying attention? The letters started coming in. Veterans who had been in Mike's shoes, families who had lost someone they loved, people who had Pitbulls, who understood the unfair labels attached to them, people who didn't, but now wanted to. And then, something even bigger happened. Shelters began receiving more calls, not from people looking to surrender their dogs, but from people looking to adopt, especially pit bulls, especially dogs left behind by veterans. Because suddenly, these weren't just dogs. They were stories waiting to be told. For Diesel, life became something different, too. He was no longer a shadow of loss, no longer a dog waiting for something, or someone, who would never return. He had a home now, and he had John. At first, it was small things. The way Diesel started following John to the mailbox each morning. The way he would nudge John's hand when he sat too long at his desk, lost in thought. The way his tail, once still and lifeless, began wagging just a little when John walked into the room. But then, it was more. He started to run again, not just move. He started to play, chasing after a ball John tossed across the yard, the sheer force of his excitement sending leaves scattering in every direction. And one day, without thinking, Diesel did something he hadn't done since Mike was alive. He climbed onto the couch, settled right next to John, and rested his head in his lap. It was small, but it was everything. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, John took Diesel on their usual walk along the winding trails behind the house. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath their steps. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. Halfway down the trail, Diesel suddenly stopped. John turned, expecting to see a squirrel, maybe a deer rustling through the trees. But Diesel wasn't looking at the forest. He was looking up. The wind stirred through the trees, making the branches sway gently. The sky was painted in soft gold and lavender, the last traces of daylight stretching across the horizon. Diesel's ears perked slightly, his dark eyes fixed on something unseen. And then he wagged his tail. Just once. Soft, slow, like a greeting, like a goodbye. John swallowed past the lump in his throat. He reached down, resting a hand on Diesel's head, his fingers curling into his fur. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he murmured, "Mike, we're okay." Diesel wagged his tail again. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt just as it should be. Not perfect, not the way it once was, but whole. And that was enough. A single letter, a forgotten promise, a dog left behind, and a man who refused to let another soul be lost. This story isn't just about Diesel or Mike. It's about all of us. About the bonds we share, the ones we take for granted, and the ones that stay with us even after we're gone. No act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Aesop. If this story touched you, if it made you think, made you feel, then let it be a reminder. Sometimes the greatest rescues aren't just about saving others, they're about saving ourselves in the process. If you believe in stories that matter, if you want to hear more, subscribe to Vale Marks. Every subscriber, every comment, every share is what keeps stories like these alive. And as always, thank you for being part of something bigger,